Well, we are thrilled to have Jen Ratay here with us today. I actually met Jen in her job just previous to the Hewlett Foundation, which was working in the public management program at the Graduate School of Business, which some of you might know one of our partners, Gina Jorash, is very involved with today. But Jen was very involved for many years. Were you there, 5 years?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so 5 years at the GSB, doing all sorts of great work, programming with students and working with SSIR and all of the different arms of the Center for Social Innovation at Stanford. Jen has also worked for the Pew Charitable Trust, the National Wildlife Foundation, the World Watch Institute, and the UN Conference on Trade and Development. So she has quite a background, and that she brings into the organizational effectiveness department at Hewlett. And what's so particularly great about having her here to talk with us today is that the organizational effectiveness department is really focused on grant making and capacity building for grantees. So Jen is going to take some time to share that work with us and Hewlett's perspectives, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. So I hope everybody has brought several with them. And with that, Jen, just thank you so much for taking the time and being here.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Lindsay. It's nice to meet you all. As Lindsay said, I actually would like to make this more of a discussion. So I'll start out with a few framing remarks, share what I think is kind of the gem of what I can offer, which is just what have we learned in terms of our work with capacity building. I've learned the hard way sometimes, but really want to also hear about your experiences, since if I understand correctly, a lot of the impetus of SB2 grants are to help support organizations, to build them, to scale them, to build their capacity. So I imagine there's some expertise in the room that we can have a conversation. I've also been a fan of SB2 for a long time, so it's a pleasure to be here because of that. Just in terms of understanding where everyone is, it was great to hear where everyone worked and what they were interested in content-wise. But how, in terms of, why don't we just do a quick show of hands, in terms of your experience with capacity building as through philanthropy, how many of you would describe yourself as pretty expert in that? It's something perhaps you were an executive, shaking head.
Is there such a thing?
That's right.
That's what's a scary word.
Or perhaps a consultant to nonprofits working to help them build their capacity in different areas. Okay. And I know Jason's been involved for some time now. Okay, great. And Gina, I'd put you in that category too with your work. And then a few of you haven't had much. Okay, so we've got a few with no experience.
On the other side.
On the other side.
On the other side.
That's great. Well, so that I think that'll be helpful. So I encourage you to jump in. Disagree with me too. I'm going to be throwing out some things that we've learned over the few years at the Hewlett Foundation through the capacity building grant making. That doesn't mean that they are right. They just happen to be our experience. And so want to check those with you all. So certainly constructive criticism and disagreements can help improve our knowledge base too if you've had different experiences. What I'll do is I'll first provide a very quick overview of the Hewlett Foundation, or maybe make June do it. She's chewing, I'll do it. To narrow down to just provide quick content on what we call our Organizational Effectiveness Grants Program, in which we provide about 60 capacity building grants to our current grantees each year. And then what I'll do is share some lessons learned, and then I'll finish. If we have time, I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. I'd love to throw out and get your feedback on how would you think about evaluating capacity building grants? I was curious to hear it sounds like you're thinking about how do you evaluate certain grants that you're making in terms of some short-term indicators of progress. It's something that we think a lot about at the Hewlett Foundation, and it's particularly challenging in the area of capacity building in terms of how do we know that this work that we believe is important, but that it really is helping our grantees, our investees make progress toward their mission. So love to get your ideas on that front. And then I'll just finish with some trends that we've been seeing and a few resources that you may know about or may not if you want to continue some work in this area. Okay. In terms of Hewlett, we are not too far away from here. It's a 15-minute drive. We're over on Sand Hill Road, corner of Stanford campus. We have been making grants. The foundation was established before I was there in 1966, and the first grant was made in 67. I know that's shocking. And Bill Hewlett, who was one of the two founders of Hewlett Packard, which is on Page Mill Road, not too far away from here, he has his one of his favorite sayings was, never stifle a generous impulse. And he, you know, as I understood, that's how he led at HP, but then certainly in with his personal wealth, established with his wife and his oldest son, Walter Hewlett, the Hewlett Foundation. When Bill Hewlett passed on in 2001, he left a lot of money, billions, to the foundation, and that's how we became a $7 billion foundation, one of the nation's largest. In terms of our different grant-making areas, we have 7 very different ones. We do a lot of work internationally. It sounds like a lot of you are very interested in international giving. I would say about half of our grant-making is international. Jim will correct me if I'm getting that a little off. But then all the way to national education policy, trying to mitigate the effects of climate change, to helping our local schools here, local performing arts groups as well, reproductive health, and women's education rights. So we're really a conglomerate of a bunch of different interest areas. And the type of grant making we do was one that I would call, we try to be as strategic as possible. And what that really means is in all of our program areas, try to do a lot of research on what's already been done. You know, so for instance, in climate change, you know, what approaches to climate change have worked or not worked, and why, and then be very clear about how much money we can throw and invest in this the problem, and clarify our goals, our long-term goals, as well as our steps along the way to show that we would actually be making progress. And we spend a lot of time thinking about evaluation. It's kind of the type of grant making we do. In terms of grant size, our average grant size is $350,000, and we, compared to our large peer foundations, make a lot more general operating support grants than is usual. And those are typically multi-year, and we can talk about why that is. And now, the piece that I oversee of this is a relatively small organizational effectiveness grants program. It's about $2.5 million a year, where we're able to provide about 60 capacity building grants to our current grantees. So we have about 800 grantees each year, and then a smaller subset of those get supplemental dollars. These are basically one-year project grants where they, the current model that we have, but I recognize there are a number of different capacity building models out there, but our current model is to provide an average of $30,000 in a grant, and on top of the parent grant, which is sometimes general operating support, directly to our grantees, and that helps them hire some outside expertise that they don't have right now on staff, say for strategic planning, before fundraising planning, communications, building their evaluation systems, board development.
Do you make that decision for them, or do they come to you and say we need this?
Great question. So we typically, so we'll let our grantees know that we have this capacity building grants program, but really leave it to them to come to us to self-identify, you know, what they'd like to work on and when they'd like to work on. And we found that that's like a key indicator of success too, is kind of the readiness factor to engage in this work, since it does take some resources and some time. That said, we have had some opportunities to kind of suggest gently to our grantees that, you know, instead of a fundraising plan, perhaps we could work on some strategic planning, so to strengthen the clarity of the goals and the vision, and then maybe sequence in some fundraising planning. So while we don't always say yes to what the grantees necessarily asking for at that point, it starts a good dialogue about what is needed when. Okay.
Are you one of the few organizations that does that? I have to say it sounds very like a duh, but I don't think a lot of organizations do that. A lot of philanthropists do that.
So, you know, I'm not familiar with some of the smaller foundations in terms of, but in terms of the larger set, I have heard a number of over 250 of the largest funders actually have capacity building grants programs.
And are they always called organizational effectiveness?
Not always. So they could be technical assistance programs, management assistance programs, sometimes capacity building programs. Our program is 6 years old now, and it's actually it's modeled, although we've shifted it over the last few years, the model as we've learned, but really was modeled after the Packard Foundation's 25-year plus organizational effectiveness program. And they were really pioneers. And I think a lot of what you see in the sector in terms of capacity building came out of the Packard experience. So they were doing this work before anyone else was. And they've also contributed tremendously to the literature on what makes good capacity building grants, what to think about. They actually used to have a staff of 12 just in their capacity building grants program. That's with the change in assets, that's shrunken some. Yeah, it's a good question. But I think as we see a shift in the sector, I think maybe you've had some conversations about some of the trends in philanthropy and maybe with Regina, but one of the ones that we've seen that I think goes along with this interest in value and capacity building is also the move to more core support, and a flexible core support for grantees. Whereas, and it is tricky when we are debating within the foundation and trying to, since assessing the progress of our grants is so important, it does get a little trickier if you're providing Lindsay's nodding. General operating support grants. Since you can't attribute your grant dollar that went to keep the lights on to necessarily some improvement in program that you might be able to track through some indicators. But we do think that it's important for a number of reasons. So I want to hear from you all. You all have experiences in some fantastic corporations, and then I'm sure with different nonprofits. But how would you characterize a healthy nonprofit organization? Now, what does that mean? We talk about organizational effectiveness, but what does that look like and feel like?
I'll get us started with a little bit of cash reserve, like they're not gonna go out of business next month.
Helpful.
Not living on the edge, huh?
Maybe they don't have a mission creep. They're not jumping after every new grant, and it's not aligned with their mission. But they're able to take advantage of because they're not searching for dollars underneath chairs and change in pockets and stuff, that they can take advantage of new opportunities that come in the door.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, being flexible and adaptive, and actually being able to say no to some funding streams, which is hard to do and pretty unique. But I'd say that'd be an effective organization. Yeah. What else?
Appropriate power balance between ED and board.
Mm-hmm. You say a little bit more about that?
Especially in smaller organizations, in my experience, in terms of sort of the typical founderitis situation and how you transition away from that as organizations grow.
Mm-hmm. So then another piece of that could be succession planning. Mm-hmm. In terms of if you have a leader who's been really integral to the founding of the organization and moving on for, the organization is scaling up and now needs a different skill set. How do you manage that transition? Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I always think of infrastructure because nonprofits are always so focused on the programmatic part, but they don't have, whether it's resource policies or technology or whatever it's they need to support.
I guess I'll bring in my corporate hats and measurement and results.
Say a little bit more about that.
Just, something that I always, think about is, how can you determine success? And are there phases in your success planning rather than just being, maybe a little too over-optimistic in what you're trying to achieve, but unrealistic. So having that balance of optimism and realism.
So it sounds like goals, clear goals that are realistic, but then also
And
measures of progress. So commitment also too, because that is really hard to do in philanthropy and certainly in a number of organizations. But that taking that step back to look what's working and what hasn't worked, as opposed to just always forward looking on the next opportunity, and that certainly happens within nonprofit organizations too. What else? A lot of other things too.
I think a strong leader who can, who can inspire is incredibly important to the health of an organization. And sometimes it means that you have to bifurcate the role and have one person who is a strong administrator and another person who's a strong outside person. And I can think of one nonprofit that we've worked with that initially they had two people for it, and one person was the inside ran the organization. This is downtown College Prep, and Greg Lippman ran the school, and Jennifer Andalus was the outside person, and she could, so ice to Eskimos or whatever the phrase is, but it was a very effective way to separate it. And meanwhile, both of them got to learn a little bit of the other one's skills. So eventually, they've taken on some of each other's roles. And Greg is heading another organization, and Jennifer's got a bigger downtown college prep than she used to. But
I came from one like that. It worked really well.
yeah, but sometimes a strong leader is not willing to share that power and really willing to hire the people who fill in the gaps, and that's a problem.
And to listen.
And to listen, yes.
What else? Is there anything on the board side? You had mentioned a good relationship with the EB as one piece of it. Anything else?
Communication between the ED to the board, ED to the staff. You know, the ability to understand where the organization is and then be able to communicate that out.
Right. No board chairs going to staff and triangular relationships. And
Just getting a sense of where the work is in these economic conditions and what they need and what they need to change.
Some boards, as you all probably are aware, can really get into the details in terms of the more management piece of it, or just kind of knowing when to step back, kind of to trust the staff and the AD, when to focus on strategy versus when to dive really deeply in.
And actually having a strong and diverse board that has
exactly.
a diversity of skills that represent the community that's being served as well as the donor community. Some boards you only have people from the donor community or from the political arena, and nobody that
Or from Stanford University.
Right. Or everybody went to the same school. And it's helpful to not to prevent walking all in the same path. You have to have some people who are willing to step up and play devil's advocate, and you also have to have people who are willing to take on different roles. Someone who will champion fund development, because that is a board role as well as a staff role, which not everybody and financial management and HR policies and all those kinds of things that boards can help out with.
I'd say ownership too, and this kind of crosses all strata of organizations, but it seems to me there's always, hot potato issues that people don't want to deal with. But I think a very strong sense of clarity of who's in charge of what and who's responsible for that and who's responsible for that outcome, because it can be, how many of us have been in organizations where the project creeps around the table because no one has pointed at you and said, you know what, Jamie, you're the owner of this, and I can give you help, but you ultimately own this. So I've found that to be really damaging and morale, destructive.
Exactly. Jason, you mentioned communications, and I think it was more in the context of between the ED and the board. Communications for the organization externally is so important in terms of, for fundraising purposes. But we actually spend a fair amount of our capacity building dollars on the top type of grant, typically strategic planning, and particularly in this economic downturn when a lot of our grantees, they tend to be organizations that already have strategic plans or think in terms of what are we trying to accomplish and how will we get there. But because of the realities of this economic downturn, we've had a lot say, we actually need some help reevaluating, doing the contingency planning, and now maybe we need to reassess what some of our metrics are going to be in terms of short term, given the realities of resources being constrained. And then another big piece of it is actually communications in terms of planning that changed message or different message to different audiences that could have a fundraising component, or it could just be, if part of the mission of the organization is to change people's minds and behavior and to have a really thoughtful marketing communications plan behind that. And so we'll get some expertise to come in and help our grantees out with that. So those are all good. Is there anything else that was left off the table? Anyone want to throw anything else in?
I don't want to steal Lance's thunder, but we
But I will.
But we haven't said anything yet. I think increasingly in the last 2 years, the conversation about what's your revenue model and how well do you understand it. I mean, in addition to the point that Holly made to lead us off about cash reserves, the organizations that have an understanding of the model And occasionally the model is still, we get grants. It usually
Contributing.
now is more than that. But I think that's pretty critical in this era.
Absolutely.
And we found
Sorry.
some organizations, in fact, one that Jason's been working with, Hewlett, the model, they had a great model, and then the rules changed.
Right.
And so they're scrambling to develop a new one, and we're trying to help them with that. Jason in particular.
And it's interesting to see that they get so stuck in just, okay, we're still just a startup. Well, you're 5 years old.
Right.
You're not a startup anymore. We need to develop your development plan and really expand out of what you're trying to do. And the reliance on, well, we've always been able to meet the budget just doesn't work when you
Right.
start expanding and growing. So, that's
So it sounds like Lance, that's not it. I just keep hearing this banging.
I don't know where it's coming
They're
from.
doing lots of construction on the Flora property.
This beautiful building. Lance, you mentioned that you're interested in scaling or had some background in that, and that's something that we, capacity building. We were talking about, we both have toddlers at home.
Right.
A healthy organization, just like a person, means something in very different life cycles. So you were talking about a 5-year-old organization, maybe that's going into adolescence. But all of these things that we just talked about look pretty different if it's a startup newborn or all the way to a mature organization or an organization that's scaling. And so it's very much, it's not, there aren't the check boxes that we use, or I think that any capacity builder can use to say, okay, now we've achieved, we are now a highly successful organization, because that's not going to be relevant 6 months from now or 2 years from now as you go into a different life cycle phase. So there's this, I think, really fascinating dynamisms to this all as well. And so how we think about it is, trying to understand where the organization is. If it's a 3-person shop and there's a executive director who's doing everything from fundraising to strategy to everything, opening the mail.
It's that info email account.
That's right. To then developing 5 years later to now needing to search for new types of leaders or diversify the board. Those are those opportunities that we look for our grantees to say, all right, if we give them a quick infusion of cash here to help them get to the next level. And we like to think about our grants as really trying to leave something behind too, that hopefully that grantee organization won't have to hire that same consultant back the next year to do that same work. So and when we think about success, that's a part of it for us. Is it kind of a one-time expense, and now that knowledge or those skills kind of reside and can stay in the organization and take it to a new level.
Jennifer, could you talk a little bit about how much support you give beyond the money? There's a couple things
Sure.
you mentioned which were really interesting. So I think, one is, strategic planning is an area you guys fund a lot.
Mhm.
And so a couple things. One is, do you give them some idea of what is best practice in terms of how to be transparent and how to be inclusive and how to be iterative with staff and with the board, so that, there's percolation up and there's buy-in at the end? So I'd like to just hear kind of how you deal with that. And then the second aspect is, do you guys have a Rolodex to recommend people? Because that's the other issue, is quality. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Actually, I'll start with your second question. It's we have a Rolodex in terms of consultants our grantees have chosen to use over the last 6 years, and then we all have kind of a Rolodex of people we know in the sector. Jason, in terms of what skills he could bring toward the organization. We've actually really struggled with how do we make that more accessible, and we struggle with it for a few reasons. I mean, there's a technological reason, but what, and this came from the Packard Foundation many years as they tried different approaches, is that when we think about capacity building, I think part of it is to help our grantees become good consumers of consultants themselves. And the easy answer would be, well, which consultants do you want us to use, and just give us the contact information and fund us, and we're off and running. And as I understand from Packard's experience of decades of this, and then we've found this too in our grant making, is that sometimes that just doesn't make a very healthy consultant to grantee relationship, and that is so core to the success of the projects. In part because we just can't get away from the power dynamics of us being a major funder, sometimes the largest funder of these organizations that are trying to do organizational development and building, and really to do that effectively oftentimes have to air their dirty laundry And so what we've actually erred on the side of really trying to protect that relationship between the grantee organization and the consultant they choose to hire. Again, within that frame, we'll still get the questions of, well, do you have some good strategic planning consultants? And we'll give we always give more than one, a list of consultants. But then what we've started to do over the last year, and actually June and her team have been really helpful on this, is we actually have some really exciting systems, our grants database systems that are allowing us to really quickly pull a report to say, in the last 2 years, all the Bay Area organizations that have gone through strategic planning, and we can print a list, and essentially we provide a grantee who's looking to do that work with 10 other grantee executive directors who have just gone through or going through it now, a strategic planning process, who have vetted and found a consultant, and so that they can do some kind of peer-to-peer due diligence. And we've so far had some good results with that, and that helps a little bit. One thing I didn't mention about our foundation too is compared to the big large foundations our sizes, we're extremely leanly staffed, and so we've had to make some tough decisions too about where do we, how much can we vet consultants, and but it is absolutely, that's probably the number one indicator of a successful capacity building project is how what skills the consultant brings, how receptive the grantee organization is to working with the consultant, and that commitment and that relationship. If it breaks down, it goes off the rails, hard to recover from. And then in terms of resources, we actually have built out an internal SharePoint site where we have, on almost every type of capacity building project that we fund, we have resources that are appropriate for program staff. Since a lot of our audience is actually educating the program staff for the gatekeepers to their portfolio of grantees to help work with that group to understand what they need. So they oftentimes need resources and some training, but then we have a lot of resources. And actually I brought one, which actually Barbara Kibbe used to run the capacity building grants program at Packard. She was at school, and now she's at the Monitor Institute. But she co-wrote this book, which is many years old now, but I find it has chapters on how do you, if you're interested in finding a consultant to work on board development, for instance, what questions would you ask? Where would you go? What questions would you ask? How do you frame the engagement? What does a good consultant work plan look like? So this is at the Foundation Center website, but what we've done is we've PDF the different chapters, and so oftentimes our program staff will, if they hear that a grantee approaches them and say, I think we need some help on evaluation systems design. There's a chapter on hiring, how do you think about doing work in that area and hiring some expertise to help move you through that process. So we'll just send PDF chapters out. So that's something that I'd recommend.
How do you translate this, no pun intended, internationally? I mean, that's got to be it's a whole different ballgame level.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, do you have in country advisors? Do you have people who are here who work with them? How does that?
Mm-hmm.
Both?
That's a great question. So since half of our grant making is international, we have a few actually Mexico City, the Mexico City office and a DC office, but we actually flirted with the idea of opening an Africa office since much of our work is there, but that didn't happen with some tough decisions on resources in the last year and a half. So we still are primarily headquartered here, but our staff is out. I sit next to the Quality in Education Developing Countries team, 3 of them, and they are never in office. One is living in Africa now, and so they're out in the field. But the big issue is in some of these areas there are very few management service providers. There are very few consultants in general, and then just the quality issue emerges when you don't have a strong pipeline. And so that's a real issue that a lot of funders who fund capacity building are thinking about is, in addition to grants to our organizations, our grantee organizations, how do we help build an ecosystem of service providers that are critical? And so we've actually invested some in the Mexico area, Mexico City area. I know Packard's invested a fair amount in Africa and building some local capacity to help organizations. And you get into a tricky decisions oftentimes in terms of do you say a grantee organization puts out a request for proposals to help them with evaluation systems design. And are they able to find someone in country in Kenya, or do they need someone who comes from DC or New York? And there are going to be some cost differentials and potentially some cultural considerations as well. So It's a really good point. It's a lot when we are so blessed here with there's so many talented people who are willing either pro bono basis or as their jobs to help organizations out in the area. But not,
Well, some countries it's not part of their core dynamic of how they were founded. I mean, we were founded in a different way than everyone else, so philanthropy doesn't translate literally in some countries.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. Let me shift in. Let me just share quickly a few of the lessons that we've learned. A few of them have come out already, but and I'd love to hear potentially disagreement or yeah, that makes sense. We've experienced the same thing. One of the major lessons has just been it's been so critical to have a well-positioned internal to the nonprofit, doing the capacity building work, champion for the work. So, ideally that's a board chair and an executive director, or at least in large organizations, potentially a COO or vice president of programs, but someone who has influence over resources or space, and who can really steward or shepherd along the process. And we found that if one of the biggest barriers or bumps that along the way with some of our projects has been a change in staffing, where we lose an executive director, or we lose someone who has been that capacity building champion halfway through the strategic planning process. And it is so hard to get things back on track at that point. So it's one, at the onset, making sure you have a well-positioned champion, plural if you can. And then two, we're starting to think a lot about succession, like a transition plan, even with capacity building grants. So if this person is not there, and you all know from your work with nonprofits that the tenure of some leaders in nonprofits is not that great. And we've had even a subset of our grantees where it was it was a 3-year capacity building grant, and by it was like a year and a half in, 50% of the people had actually transitioned. And so we didn't plan for that. And so now we're learning that lesson the hard way. Does that?
You think of one person leaving an organization of,
right,
small organization, and feels paralyzing,
And there's another point which I can tell off. This one is organizations that are in crisis, and for small organizations that lose the key staff person, that can certainly be the case. That is not the right time for self-reflective capacity building and learning when they need a quick infusion of cash, or if there's, or for other organizations, maybe some of the big organizations, they just found out that they lost the major donor. It's a time for planning, but it's also you've got to respond quickly. If there's an earthquake or a flood, you just need a quick infusion of cash. It's not time to be doing the sticky notes on the whiteboard.
Yeah, I just experienced that twice with SB2 because we focus on such small organizations. One had 100% staff turnover, and one had 100% board turnover in the year that I was with them. So
So you were like the actual
was
one
the
person.
guinea pig.
Yeah, you were the stable person.
You were
with all
maybe the champion.
yeah,
You were the glue.
you lose a lot of everything. I mean, even just going through with what we thought we were going to go through with the strategic plan or whatever it was we were doing with them, when you lose 100% of your staff, the ED is just focused on keeping everything going.
Right.
Or the board turns over, you don't know, a lot of things change. So.
Jennifer, what's the range of budget sizes that you have for your 60 grantees now, from small to large?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So we have made capacity building grants as small as $5,000.
I mean, the size of the organization.
Oh, I'm sorry. The size of the organization. Oh, it's
so
so $5,000 to $60,000 grants.
Right.
But the organization, that can be all over the place. That can be from the very small 2-person community organizations all the way toward the multilateral and aid agencies, hundreds of $1 million organizations, the big guys, and everything in between. In terms of a sweet spot, I actually do think it's those organizations that are earlier in their career or their stage of life, or scaling, or just coming out of, they have gone through what you just described in terms of extreme turnover. They're starting to get their feet under, and now they need to plan. They need to start building the foundations out. So there are a few sweet spots in there, but we actually do fund all over the place since our grantees are so different in size and life cycle.
Well, could you talk a little bit about different approaches for the small guys maybe versus the medium guys? Because I mean, we don't fund anything over $4 million
Okay.
as an operational
Sure.
budget. Typically, it's 2 or less. But then we stay with them. We fund them for 3 years, and then we stay with them within the portfolio forever, right? So we have a spectrum.
Right.
So I'm just interested in how you approach
Sure.
things of different sizes, and how you
Sure.
think about them, and how you deal with them over the period.
Sure. So sometimes we find with smaller organizations, some of them have never worked with consultants before. So there's some of the piece that I already talked about in terms of helping them be educated consumers of outside expertise that they might not have. So that's a piece of it. Another piece of it is sometimes it's helpful depending on, and this isn't unique necessarily to small organizations, but oftentimes there will be this appetite to do something. We need to build our organization, but there won't be a lot of agreement or clarity about what the highest priority needs are. So what we find sometimes with smaller organizations is that to encourage them to go through a self-assessment, there are capacity building or self-assessment tools that are free and that are out there that will oftentimes recommend if the need is essentially to identify a capacity building plan, as opposed to some of the larger organizations. They have a big team, they've worked with consultants, they've already done their strategic planning, and they're just at a different level of fine-tuning now the exact metrics that they are going to track, and they need to design the data systems. Where some of the smaller organizations are just, it's still, they need help everywhere. They don't have a communications plan or strategic plan, or their board, they're just putting together designing their board committees, and they have no HR department at that point, and they're coming up with policies. So it's really it's more help in terms of the planning. How do we sequence this different support in the right way? And then, and you said, and it sounds like you all do this effectively, is stay with them. Too, for the big organizations, it's oftentimes you give them money, one-shot deal. They already know who they want to hire. They run. There tends to be more technical assistance, some guidance in terms of, whether we do the organizational assessment, so providing some data back, reflecting back to the organization's leadership what might be needed when, and then sharing that plan with the Hewlett Foundation staff, and then us committing to say, okay, we can't promise we'll be giving money. We give you the 3 years general operating support. You can spend that on anything you want, but on top of that, we'll work with you on strategic planning, and then next year it sounds like you, at least right now, think you're going to be interested in communications planning, and we'll work with you through those steps. So it's a little more tailored, I would say. Good question. So actually, this is a little bit dovetailing what I just said too. Is some of the people in the capacity building sector think of capacity building a bit like a Mongolian barbecue, is particularly with these type of organizations. You go in and you're looking at all the different options, and you need all of them, and you pile it on your plate, and you want to hire every consultant to do it. And for those of you who have been consultants or have been, how many of you, and Jean's probably been in this role, have actually been in an organization and you've been the one to manage the consulting relationship? So what we find is typically nonprofits, particularly the smaller ones, tend to underestimate how much time it takes to manage a consultant.
Because you're like, oh, they're going to do
That's
everyone
right.
else thinks they're doing the work.
That's why we're hiring them. It's free labor.
Right.
Right. So we've all been through those, and you typically look back and say, oh, I wish I had planned for more time to have those meetings with the consultants, to rewrite their survey, or whatever it may be. But so because of all of this, kind of our eyes bigger than our stomach, we typically in our grant making would recommend kind of a sequenced approach to capacity building, having organizations focus on their highest priority needs first, and then making sure we can understand what they'd like to do next and help support them, but really focus the energy, the limited energy, emotional and otherwise, on the highest priority capacity building needs, as opposed to doing, say, 5 things at the same time. That has typically been a mess and also as a corollary, having multiple consultants. So you think working with just one consultant, working with 3 or 4 consultants in a small organization on different topics at once. Our grantees have come back to say, our consultants are telling us different things. This is not clarifying. This is confusing for us. And so that's also kind of a pink flag for us, is when we look at what our grantees are saying that they need. And then we'll work with them to try to help guide them in terms of some focus, and then picking the consultants that would be appropriate. Another piece that we've learned is that cost sharing. So we're a very well endowed foundation. We could pay the whole cost of the consulting service for our grantees. But often we think that it's best not to. Sometimes, and we have no rule of thumb, but sometimes we think they're paying 80% with the grantee organization investing something, so they have some skin in the game. And I just think that's human nature in terms of if you have some skin in the game, you're going to plan for it a little better, make sure the right staff is in place to make the project go and be implemented. So,
what are the factors that lead you to that decision versus 100%?
Level of commitment, and oftentimes our program officers will have a sense of that. So you all know certain leaders who it's just in their blood to focus on building the organization. These are the people who there's something in your gut that just says, I can give my money to them, and they're the type of leader that are going to run an effective organization, and then not everyone is that way, and so sometimes it is helpful to, if you're not quite sure that the money's going to be spent, well, have this conversation of, well, if we gave you 80%, where would you find that other money, and how would you deploy your team on this? How are you going to engage your board? And it's not, as I said, there's no real line in the sand on that one. It's just a general practice that we've started to engage in. And since we do have this core support, general operating support that we provide many of our grantees, they can tap into some of that, certainly. And this leads me to another piece of it. And we are a large foundation, so this is understandably easier for us to do, but we found that a mix of funding types can actually be highly effective for capacity building. A question I always get, and I actually had the same question when I came to the Hewlett Foundation, it was about 3 years ago now. Well, if we give so much general operating support, why would we bother doing all this extra grant making on capacity building? It seems logical. If they're really committed to strategic planning, they will pay $40,000 to hire, so to come and help them do that. Well, the reality, and those of you who have led organizations, it can feel a little bit like robbing Peter to pay Paul when you're dealing with a constrained organization budget. Yes, you have general core support for some of that work, hopefully. But it's really pretty powerful for that champion internally, I can just say it's the executive director, to say that they have from the Hewlett Foundation or some earmarked money specific for strategic planning that they can only use for that, and it's protected. And you don't get into all of these different perspectives within an organization of, well, no, you're taking money away from program, and we're going to serve 10 fewer people now because we're going to be doing this evaluation system design. And so that's some of the feedback that we got is, those $30,000 project support grants for a specific organizational development need can be transformative sometimes if they're timed at the right time based on need. Versus some of the big core support, those are so important to the organization's flexibility and health too. But that mix together can be quite powerful.
How much of your decision on whether to grant to the organization is based on their readiness? It seems like they have to be ready. So do you base a lot of that on how much they're asking, how much detail they put into putting that strategy together? Is it a mission 50%, 50% ready? Is it what
It's a good question. There are really no firm rules on that or guidelines. All of our grantees have to go through it's nice to meet you, a very rigorous regular application process, and so they're clear at that point, or else we wouldn't provide them with $350,000 check on what they're trying to accomplish and how will they get there, and do they have, that's where you do all the financial due diligence. So they've gone through that, and then it's typically, organizational management challenges, leadership challenges are ongoing and normal. So we'll expect to see those emerge on a regular basis from all of our grantee organizations. And so it's really how we think about getting out our capacity building dollars is really those, we've gone through a number of exercises really relevant in this economic downturn. In our portfolio of grants, we are trying to see some 5-10 year change. And in our portfolio, we're going to have organizations that are key to our strategies. because of what they do. They're just so aligned with what we're trying to accomplish in the world in terms of climate change or education systems improvement. But we have to make sure that they survive and they are thriving really in 5 years from now, as opposed to one year. And so we've actually had to make some really hard decisions this year, both in terms of the parent grants, but also in terms of capacity building grants. We're now kind of rationing these dollars, and we've essentially had to make decisions that if it doesn't look like the organization is strong enough to survive, and they're not central to our strategies so that we need them around 5 years from now, we've had to let some of them go. So we've had a lot of hard, we try to tie them off with some money so they're not going off the cliff, but we'll say, in a year and a half, we can't support you with core support. And then there's sometimes it really depends on the situation. Sometimes we'll provide capacity building support for those organizations that are exiting our portfolio, sometimes on fundraising or strategic planning to help them give them a bit of a runway to go out on. But it's really the decision of where to, so I don't make the decisions in terms of where all the money goes. I approve the money. If the proposal is thoughtful and if it's within the guidelines, then provide the money. It's really each program officer who manages their own portfolio and understands these questions of strategy, who's doing the best work, and we need to make sure that they survive and they know in a lot of detail what other funders are doing and thinking and who the leader is at that point. And so it's a really kind of a dynamic set of decisions constantly. And the last thing I'll say is just on the, so I don't know if you all find this, but no matter how much trust there is between a funder and a grantee, there's still this power dynamic that we can't get away from. And so when grantees are going through the proposal process, particularly for their regular grant, their parent grant, it's still a bit of a sell job all the way until we call them up and say, congratulations, the board has approved your grant. 3-year operating support grant, now, and then there's this window that we've come to realize is that's actually the sweet spot of our program staff now saying, all right, we are partners for the next 3 years. Let's really talk honestly now about what you all need to build your organization so that we can reach our shared goals. And you become much more of a partner there because they know that that dirty laundry that they air to you then is not going to affect their grant. But it is much harder to have those conversations in the kind of the proposal process. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of why we've separated those two pieces is the big parent grant and this supplemental grant.
Eleanor Clement Glass, who runs the donor engagement group here at the foundation, uses this analogy for that about dating. She always talks about grant making is like dating, and like everyone should be allowed to go on a first date and put their best foot forward. Like the funder should be allowed to, the grantee should be allowed to. If you went on a first date with someone and they said, okay, let me tell you about everything that's wrong with my mother, or
Right.
my family or my job or whatever, like you wouldn't go on another date. So it's okay, and it's sort of that process of by the time you get married. In this case, to your grantee, are you having that conversation? And I always just thought the analogy sort of brings that into focus in a nice way because it can be, I've found, so tricky when, like, I know we're really here to help. I know it's okay if you tell me
Right.
the hard thing on the first date, but you don't know. And I might be wrong. I might think it was okay that you told me and it's not. So I think the analogy is, yeah.
How long for both of you are the,
And not that I'm making a funding decision, but.
like, how long is the dating process for both of you?
SV2 dates, how long does SV2 date? 6 months?
6
Yeah,
months.
it's right.
Oh, really?
Sure.
It's
Yeah,
a
sure.
grant round.
It's 2 or 3 meetings, maybe. I mean, you talked to them on the phone and then they came in.
The 6 months, does that count? for
Not
the
that he
time
was
we
dating,
first-
but
counting the time that we first started looking at all the organizations, or the time that we contact them and begin kind of back and forth?
probably contact
Yeah, it's
from.
much shorter. It's like 3 months.
Yeah.
But they don't really open up to you
Until
3 to 6 months into your consulting sometimes about
Yeah,
what's
what do you-
really
So you're finding
It's in that
after
window.
the consulting engagement starts, it's 3 to 6 months, sometimes after that?
3 months.
It depends. it depends which one you're talking about. So you're talking about Bossy. So about 1.5 years ago, we implemented the McKinsey tool, the organizational
Oh, yeah,
capacity
sure.
assessment. That's been real helpful
Okay.
because so they've gotten the grant. Okay, we're now married, and then we do the OCAD,
For
right?
3 years,
Like,
just for 3 years.
Yeah, which flushes it all out.
So you do the McKinsey tool after they get the grant or before they get the grant?
After the grant, but before the grant.
Right
There we
after,
go. Okay.
Right after with the board chair and the ED, as a minimum, right?
Right.
And so then we do the debrief, and then we plan this, the strategy. So it's the same thing. Sweet spot's the first 6 months to 12 months. So we try to get as much done as we can in the first 6 months.
I was actually referring to Reach, where it was
Oh,
coming
yeah?
out
Okay.
a couple of the consulting meetings after. It was like, okay, this is broken, and we don't know how to fix this, and that finally came out. One of them, it was fundraising. It was just, this model's not working.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so hard for people to open up. I mean, it's kind of tied to one of the other questions I was going to ask, because you mentioned strategic planning, fundraising, Marcom, but I didn't hear executive coaching, because people don't like to ask for it, or they don't think
That's
they
a great
need it,
one.
but they sure do.
Right. Or board development work, or
Right.
yeah.
Does the program manager program officer get involved and offer that?
So actually, so that is one of our big funding areas, but I would agree that's a really tricky one to navigate.
Right.
Comes from different sources. And actually sometimes that's where we find actually being a little more prescriptive about using an org assessment tool can be very helpful. Because then you get perspectives, it can be anonymous data rolled up into one, and it can be read back to the organization.
Right.
And then, so yes. And oftentimes we'll pair so sometimes executive coaching standalone, but typically paired when there's some sort of executive leadership transition. So we'll make sure that the icing's on the cake with some coaching afterwards, and then certainly clarity on on what type of leader is needed on the front end before the search process starts. Yeah.
Jennifer, how long do you guys date before you get married?
That was 12 years.
This is going to be the best podcast ever.
Exactly. It's all about
Dating efficiency with the Hewlett Foundation.
I mean, ours is so
Right.
ours is so short. I'm just wondering how long do you
What do
usually
you
get to know
think?
your grantee before you make the 3-year commitment?
That's so, because so many of our grants are renewals.
Right.
I would say
At
at
the
least
house,
half
renewals.
ours. So we give them a 3-year grant, we give them another one. So
Oh, you've been doing it for 30
that,
years.
You've already been married for a long time.
But what about your new ones? Yeah.
The new
Not
ones
the
take
Val
a
renewals.
lot longer. And I would say I'll speak to the philanthropy portfolio. I would say 9 months easily. It also depends if there's an organization yet. So sometimes it's just an idea, and those will. For instance, I don't know if you've heard of the group called Philanthropy. Okay. Oh, and so that was an idea. Oh gosh, maybe 14 months ago, where some talented Stanford students had an idea about that they could do getting expert reviews on nonprofits. It's been a really hard question. It's actually been a question of scale. It's very hard to make the economics of such a service possible work. And so had met with Paul Bress, my boss, who's the president of the foundation, and a colleague of mine in the philanthropy program, just to bat around, well, how could we make this work? We gave them a small planning grant. It was a 3-month planning grant to see if they could, actually get something, come up with a white paper, and that we could get it out to some people in the field, and we could really work on the idea. And then they just took that on, did a great job, and then the next step, and this is pretty unique, but we were able to provide them a little bit of space within the Hewlett Foundation and kind of been incubated there. So they have a grant, and it's all been pay for performance. If these specific milestones are met, then and I think we're looking at another grant that'll hopefully get them so they ramp up and they're starting to get some publicity. So that's an example where it's real hands-on. There's a lot of dating going on to get to then the marriage, if you will, some of maybe eventually 3-year general operating support grant, with the thought that with continued performance that would be renewed.
Is that a trend in the pay by milestone? I've noticed that in the obviously in the corporate world as well, but
Right.
I'm curious in the big foundation world if that's gaining some traction.
So we do something, we've done it now for the past 4 years, called our worst grant contest, from which we learn the most.
God.
There's skits and hats and belts.
Oh my God. And no video cameras and no.
Yeah, I think legal works.
It's been really interesting how it's evolved. That contest, answer your question because it's related to this year's contest, but that's been a really important culture building experience for us as grant makers. There's not a lot to help us, essentially force us to look back, learn about what's working, and do our work better. We were pretty insulated as funders in terms of what the government imposes on us in terms of performance, and so we kind of have to build these systems on our own. So 4 years ago, Paul Brest had this idea of, well, let's have all programs. I talked about the 7 different program areas we have. All nominate. They nominate their best grant because that's easy to talk about, and then their worst grant from which we learned the most. And in that first year, and this is right as I was coming on board, all the grants that were nominated by programs were because the executive director of our grantee left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or the another major funder pulled out of the funding relationship. Nothing that we actually had any responsibility for or could control. And so we've been trying to evolve this contest over the next few, 2 and 3 years ago, toward a strategic failure. So something that was actually not at all an organizational development issue on the behalf of the grantee. They're performing great. It was actually a design decision on our part or something that we had influence over that was just turned out to be a bad call in retrospect. And we've also shifted from having to pair it with the best grant. We've slowly become more comfortable just talking about failure and what we can learn from it. And so last year's worst grant contest happened to be we give a lot of grants to academic centers and researchers. I know that's different from the type of grant making you do, but what we found was there was the incentives with academic researchers and to get the information, which is usually why we funded them, the research, but we don't want the research that sits on shelves. We wanted to actually influence policy. Mm-hmm. But we really couldn't get this pay for performance thing. So we've actually started shifting and holding some of our grant dollars to make sure that certain milestones happen. It actually came out of some discussions with grants that haven't gone very well, particularly with academic researchers. But it could be extended. We now think of it as how couldn't we use some of the system, the opportunities we have for reporting with our grantees and the timing. If we have a 3-year grant commitment, there are ways to provide the money at different points. At the same time, we also are funding these organizations because we think that they're doing great work and we don't want to be too heavy-handed. So it's a fine balance. But we have started to talk about it this past year. And then June, who won the worst grant award this year?
Your career.
In my first grant at the foundation. It was a capacity building grant. It was capacity building one too, where it was actually it's a different model of capacity building, but I don't know if you all are at any point thinking about it, but it was a peer learning community, which we had fun.
Oh. Yes.
Yes. Thinking about it.
Right now, well, we're about to fund a cohort in out of school time organizations.
Oh, okay. Great. Well, at any point, I'd be happy to share some lessons that we had learned. Everything from staff transition. That was the example where we had 50%. It was a 3-year learning community, and within the first year and a half, 50% of the people who were the ones actually participating in the learning community were on to different jobs.
Great.
There are a lot of, in terms of different, who you have in the community, teams versus individuals.
I've put it on the list here.
Was this in an area that tends to have high turnover within the individual organizations on top of it, or?
That's a really good question. It was actually some community-based organizations, which I think will perhaps have higher turnover for certain reasons. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So my inclination is yes to that question.
Well, we have I won't take a lot of time to talk about it here because we only have a few more minutes with you, but it's a collaborative not only of the organizations that get funded, but also of 3 funders doing the funding. So it's like collaboration upon collaboration.
Sounds like ours.
And the other 2 funders are the Sandhill Foundation and the Packard Foundation.
Okay,
and so we're very fortunate, particularly as regards having learnings about past cohorts of having Packard involved because they've done it
so they were
a number of
with
times.
This one as well.
Oh, good.
And so they can share some.
But so one great example is we had a meeting a couple weeks ago about Sandhill is working on hiring the facilitator of the cohort, and Packard said, we were talking to different people on staff who've done cohorts before, and one recommendation that they had for us was that we narrow to 2 that we would be, equally comfortable hiring, and we let the cohort choose their facilitator, which is a little bit like to your point earlier about choosing your consultant. And that was, that's something we as SV2A probably would never have thought of if we were doing it on our own, and B, we might not have taken the risk of saying, no, we have to like them. It's not, we can't hand that decision over. And so I think we are able, hopefully, to leverage a lot of learnings. And I'm sure we'll make mistakes, but I hope it doesn't win the worst grant.
And actually, that was so. The Spur Learning Community, this cohort model, we're only a year and a half in, and so it was actually great because now we're able to recover from some of these things that we learned the hard way. And we were actually, Packard was really helpful because they have a lot of experience in this, but we almost went in this peer learning community model almost, I think, to the other end of the spectrum in terms of having the peer learning group develop everything. And what I mean by everything is, which consultant, what the logic model of the work was going to be, essentially what are the goals and the outcomes, and what the indicators of progress are, and it essentially took a year to get just the planning meetings started. And so at that point, this is just a momentum issue that we had a bit of trouble with the transition. So there's probably some nice balance that's in between that. You still get the ownership, you get the right people, but you're making some progress, because if people get frustrated if they don't see that things are happening in some realistic amount of time.
And consortium, when you have different people who, this is their side stuff that they're doing. Getting people to commit is a huge shift. The organization I'm chair of, most of our work is done with this big consortium called the Vision Council that put together the Children's Agenda, and it has people from government and people from nonprofits, and they all sit at the table, and there are people who will derail the whole process just if their particular thing doesn't come out as the very top priority of everything. And you have to really manage the process carefully.
Absolutely.
Why don't we have a either or a final question or a closing thought, and then hopefully there's a few minutes if people have lingering thoughts for Jen, but we'll let you all get back to your work days.
Just one quick question, Jen. So how are you sharing your learnings with the whole 800 grantee portfolio? You only go through the program manager, or can you put out kind of examples of, best, success stories and offerings, and how do you deal with that?
That's a really great question. It's actually something I don't think we do very well. But that's where we could get a lot of leverage. One thing that we are just starting to do, I think instead of biting off everything, all the types of capacity building work that we do, we're actually starting this year to, we've never done this before, if we can get examples of good strategic plans, and that we can, if we get the permission to share those with program officers and in other programs, and then with other grantees. It's just something simple that we are planning to do this year that we haven't done before. That just could be a model. So that's one example. We've actually, and this is a little bit different. We won't have time to talk about evaluation, but it is something that we've struggled with. Is we essentially have to continue to make a value proposition for this work. I mean, millions of dollars, and what do we have to show for it? And so we're experimenting with a new application this year that actually has a very light version of a capacity self-assessment to try to get a baseline. Again, we're walking that fine line between, is that in the sweet spot when people are going to be, what are they going to say? What they think we want to hear, but then ask the same set of questions at the end of the engagement, a year out, and then follow up some years down the road to see what's sticking or not. But we also this year, I don't know if anyone's heard of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. There's a grantee perception report. It's something we've done since 2003, and June was really helpful this year on ours. We did both a staff perception report and a grantee perception report at the same time, and we're able to add some custom questions to the grantee. So this is getting to the 800, asking them some specific questions about how we can do our grant making better, what would help them build their organizations. And then we added a few capacity building related questions to that in terms of what they most needed, particularly in this strange, difficult economic time. And then for those, we were able to look at cut the data by those who had gotten capacity building grants from us. Did they look any different than the other 740 that didn't? And actually, statistically significantly different on a whole bunch of dimensions in terms of their perceptions of the foundation's impact in our fields of funding, our relationships with our grantees. The list goes on and on. And then we did for the first time gather some baseline data in terms of how whatever grant they got, and again it's all different. It's comparing apples, oranges, and tomatoes in terms of type of capacity building grant. But how do they feel that believe that's impacting their ability to achieve their mission? Does it matter at all, or is it having significant impact? And so we have a number now that's hard to put in context. We don't have any comparative data from other foundations on the same question. But we're hoping to then have that be a baseline that we can track over time to see if these grants, if we're getting any better at doing capacity building grants as perceived by our grantees in terms of, is this capacity building work helping them be more effective at achieving the intended impact?
So that leaves me with maybe a fast final question then, which is, does that make you think about the dollars that you allocate toward capacity building? If there's a statistically significant difference with the organizations that get it, is there a strategic conversation about more or not really?
I think this year we're going to have one. We actually, just with the foundation, we were down a lot in our grant making. Our asset size shrunk a lot. And we're moving back in the other direction, thankfully, although I'm not sure about yesterday.
That was weird.
That was weird. It essentially meant all the programs took a really big hit, and we did the same thing, even though we had a lot of people saying, actually, maybe we should increase the capacity building dollars in this time because these are so valuable, but we also wanted to, take that's exactly right. So thank you all. This has been great to hear your thoughts, your excellent questions. Really appreciate it. And this kudos for the work that you're doing in terms of your financial commitment as well as your time involvement. That's really inspirational. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.